Hi, my name is Taylor Scheinek. I'm a recent graduate of the University of New Orleans Interdisciplinary Studies program with a focus on urban design and economics. Today I'll be addressing and analyzing the design of the soon to be completed RTA Cemeteries Transit Center and what I think was done well and what could have been done differently or better. So the first thing that I'd like to actually cover is shelter design, and this is actually going to be the primary purpose of this analysis. Um, the shelter you see right here is actually the Bay B shelter. So this is the one that will serve the buses that use this transit center as a turnaround. This, while aesthetically an excellent design, I have to give it to whoever designed this. In terms of whether or not it's attractive, it actually is a very attractive design. You have the stylized brackets linking the overhead roof structure to the brick columns, and the style of the benches is even very attractive and is not overly anti-homeless people. But I'd like to direct your attention to the functional design of this shelter, because unfortunately, despite the fact that I am using the term shelter right now to describe it, that is one thing that this most likely will not actually do very well. The only vertical shelter element to this design are the glass panes that are placed between the columns. You can see them behind the benches. The problem with this is, as you can imagine, in New Orleans we do not necessarily have vertical rain. We do have horizontal rain, and this is a problem that is faced by the existing transit shelters, the prefabricated ones, and I will address that momentarily. But the problem here is that the roof is only 10 feet wide overall, which gives you about 5 feet on each side of the columns. The height, the clearance height, is around 8 feet. And what this means is that any substantial amount of rain is going to result in people having to move from one side of the shelter to another in order to actually stay dry. And even then, most likely they will have some difficulty doing so. I'll show you another aspect of this design momentarily that adds to this problem. Now, if you look at the benches and how they're placed, they actually extend beyond the shelter's overhang at either end. This is an obvious problem, but I'd like to pause for a moment and point out something that I actually am very much in favor of as far as a part of this design. The lighting in these shelters is actually connected to the mains, so this is not solar powered. So these lights are bright and they will be reliable. Those are two critical aspects of lighting in a public amenity or facility such as a transit center. You have to have lights. You have to have them that are bright but not obnoxious, and they need to be reliable. Additionally, the color temperature of these lights, I went back after dark to see how they looked. It's actually a very nice white color. It's not overly cold in terms of the color temperature, which there's a whole psychology aspect of that. So this is actually a really great improvement over the existing solar-powered LED lights that the prefabricated transit shelters use, that often either don't work or simply do not provide sufficient lighting for what they are actually being used for. Now, as I said before, this is another problem that we have with this design, which is the way that drainage is handled coming off of the roof itself. Now, the roof nicely enough, is designed with gutters, so the rain that is being blocked or caught by the roof itself does not just run off in a curtain of water between the streetcar or the bus and the waiting riders. The problem is that, as you can see here, this stormwater is not actually routed into a storm drain. It's simply routed out of the base of each column onto the platform itself. I really can't comment on this without without breaking formal tone. I'm sorry, but this is a stupid decision. I'm hoping that there was a reason why this was done. I don't think that any reason is truly valid as an excuse, but I would like to at least know that somebody came up and said, well, we can't do this because. The fact that the answer to this was not, well, we need to find a way to do it. That's the problem. We have very heavy rainstorms in New Orleans, in case anyone listening to this has forgotten. And so what that means is, in a heavy rainstorm, you are going to have waiting transit riders who are most likely going to be standing at this point, because if you were sitting, you would probably be a little bit closer to the rain than you would like. So we're going to have people milling about trying to stay out of the rain, and they're going to have to actually watch their shoes so that they don't accidentally step into this rushing stream of water that's coming out of this downspout onto the platform itself. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, a train station in New York City that had this problem, a subway station even. Let's go to Brooklyn. Let's go to where the subways are actually above ground, where they've gone to the elevated design. Would you accept a design if it had a shelter with rushing water coming across it? Of course not. You would not. This is ridiculous. This is a silly and short-sighted design that should have been caught early on. Unfortunately, the project is almost complete now, so any solution is going to involve cutting up and digging up this freshly poured concrete and going to additional expense when it could have simply been sorted early on. Additionally, the waiting area for the streetcars themselves does not appear to actually have any drainage beyond the general gradient of the pavement. What that means is, as you can see, if you look in the background just beyond the handrail of the bench, you can see a storm drain on the curb of Canal Boulevard. That storm drain is essentially the destination for any and all rainwater that falls on this area of the transit station. This is ridiculous. This, especially considering the fact that you have people milling about here, because this whole area is level and you walk directly from the transit's shelter out into the loading area where the streetcar is waiting. There should have been some sort of drainage. I don't know what form that drainage would have come. Maybe it would have been French drains. It could have been perimeter drains. It could have been something fancy and futuristic that I don't even know exists. But the fact that this entire transit center is essentially drained across the entire median, across the street, and into the storm drains on the outer curbs of Canal Boulevard is ridiculous. And I'm sure that an engineer somewhere is listening to me complain about this and shaking his head and saying, well, we just couldn't do it. I'm not blaming you. I am not blaming the people who designed this. What I'm blaming is the whole concept of how we think about this sort of infrastructure in the United States. Obviously, as I've already said, more thought has gone into the aesthetics of this design than the actual functionality of it. Primarily because, well, it looks nicer from a distance. I'm going to be very blunt about this. Most people in this city do not take public transportation. So people who are driving by need to be looking at something pretty. If it was functional but ugly, they would have objected to it, especially considering the historic nature of this intersection, what with the cemeteries on two sides, actually three sides of the intersection, meaning that we could not have had an ugly, overly functional, maybe brutalist design. Unfortunately, most people who will actually be using this infrastructure, this transit center, would likely prefer the ugly, brutalist design with a high degree of functionality over this very aesthetic and pretty design that has a low degree of functionality. Let's address the issue of the city's prefabricated shelter design for a moment. These are the shelters that are being installed at bus stops and transit stops around the city. These are, I'm sorry, but these are very badly designed shelters. I know why the badly designed parts were designed the way that they were, but that's no excuse. So here's the problem with these shelters, and I have actually tested this, not intentionally, but these do not actually protect you. In a heavy rainstorm, there is virtually nowhere in this shelter that you can stand that you will not get wet. The only actual solid side of this shelter is the side panel that contains the illuminated advertising. In this photograph, you can see the two plexiglass panels, one on each of these shelters. Obviously, rain can get through those. However, if you look, you can't see it in this photograph, but next time you are near one of these things, go up close and look. The somewhat transparent looking panels on the other two sides of the shelter are actually perforated metal. So in a heavy rainstorm where the wind is blowing the rain, no matter which direction the rain is coming from, unless it's coming from the one direction, that very narrow side, and it's hitting directly against the plexiglass, you're going to get wet. I have stood underneath one of these waiting for the Hain bus, which comes at most every 40 minutes. I'm not sure what the schedule is now. I have stood under one of these in a heavy rainstorm in a rain suit, and I have still gotten wet. It is appalling how badly these actually function in their role. Additionally, we have that same problem, which is the lighting, and it's simply not bright enough. I'm sorry. It needs to be mains powered, and it needs to be bright. It needs to be bright enough that you can clearly see the features of someone sitting next to you or across to the other side of the shelter, and it simply isn't. If you were walking by, you would basically have to come up and see the person you were trying to see their face. You could not see it from far enough away. So I really do need to put, I mean, of course, I don't have a foot to put down, but metaphorically speaking, I have to put my foot down and say, this is a bad design, and the city needs to find a new design to replace it. I understand that these are, quote unquote, attractive. They're appealing to drivers who don't want to see an ugly monstrosity on the corner of the street as they drive by, and residents probably don't object to them as much as other designs. However, this design simply does not do its job, and any design that does not do its job should not be considered for use by any entity anywhere, whether it's public, private, city, municipal, parish, county, national level. I don't care what level. If you are trying to pick a design that is supposed to do something, definitely do not pick the one that doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do. So here we have three minor issues of design and coordination, and I'm going to go from left to right in this case. So in the first photograph, we see the end of, no, this is the shelter that is for the streetcar loop. This is a minor issue. It doesn't actually impact the functionality of the transit center. However, this is an example of somewhere a little more coordination between the engineering and the design teams perhaps could be useful. There is this very large utility box on the end of the transit shelter that just kind of ruins the aesthetic. And as I said, the one thing that absolutely hands down this design has going for it, it has it in spades, is the aesthetic design of the shelters. These are very attractive shelters. So why anyone felt it necessary to ruin those aesthetics on one end of this design with this ugly box, which, by the way, is visible directly from the crosswalk, which I'm actually I'm not standing in the crosswalk per se, but I'm standing close enough to it. And I just see no reason for this to be here other than the fact that nobody really thought whether it could be put somewhere else. Moving on to the second photograph, we see a really unusual sidewalk. So the grade of the street, as far as I can tell here, because it's been a while since I've actually been on this corner, I believe the grade of the street was raised here. If it wasn't, then it doesn't stop this from being a bad design. But starting from the corner where that red Honda Odyssey is, you actually come down about 1.5 to 2 feet, simply so that the sidewalk meets a 12 by 12 drainage grate that services the sidewalk and apparently the parking lot behind that fence. Here's a problem. So this shows a amazing lack of foresight. That banner on the fence, if I recall correctly, is a lease banner. So this is proper. And even if it wasn't, let's pretend for a second that that's not what that sign says. We have unprecedented levels of development and growth in the city right now. This property could very well in the next couple of years become more profitable and more desirable as a developed property, i.e. with a building on it, than a parking lot. So how do we go about that? I mean, this complicates any design a architect or engineer or development company or property developer would want to actually come up with for this corner, because now we have a sidewalk that comes down 2 feet only to go back up 2 feet simply to service a drain that may very well be pulled out when the property is redeveloped. I'm sorry. And yes, I'm sure that the property developer will foot the bill to have this redone, but they shouldn't have to. This should have been done in a sane and sensible way the first time around. And if that meant putting in a railing or something, maintaining the level grade and then putting in a railing so that people couldn't fall off the sidewalk, I know how ridiculous that sounds, but hey, and then removing the railing at a later date when the property is developed or there's a reason to. I'm sorry, but this is just not good design. If you're dealing with somebody who is physically handicapped or impaired, if they're not in a powered wheelchair, now they have to not only negotiate a down ramp, but negotiate an up ramp for no reason whatsoever. Finally, in the third photograph, this really is just a little issue. These are the benches that are underneath the breezeway connecting the streetcar bay to the bus bay. They're right at the edge of the canopy. I'm sorry, but the whole issue of whether or not it actually is a shelter comes into play again here. These do nothing to really harm the functionality of the breezeway, because the primary function of this structure is to protect people walking from one end of the transit center to the next end. And in that, it actually does a pretty good job because the columns are on the outside. As you can see, the columns are on either side of the breezeway as opposed to running down the center. But if you're going to put benches, I don't see why some sort of accommodation for protecting the people sitting in them could be made against the elements. Finally, we come to the issue of infrastructure design. In this series of photographs, I'm standing in the crosswalk looking towards City Park Avenue and Oddfellows Rest. And we're seeing a procession of cars turning from the eastbound lanes of City Park Avenue onto Canal Boulevard. Now, the striping of this stretch of the street is clearly, obviously, a one-lane stretch of street. The diagonal cross-hatching stripes that you see in the fore and the background clearly mark this as a no-go zone for cars. This is an area that is supposed to be dedicated purely to transit and to pedestrians in the crosswalk. Now, as you can see from this series of photographs, these stripes are doing absolutely nothing. We have a BMW and another vehicle, each one turning into the stripe zone. None of these cars that are turning in this sequence of photographs are actually where they are supposed to be. And some might say, well, they just haven't gotten used to it. I say bullshit. Bullshit, horseshit, whatever kind of shit you can come up with, that is a bullshit excuse. Because I'm sorry, when I went to, and when you went to, and presumably when the people driving these cars went to take their driving test, presumably when they did the practical exam, they were able to stay between the lines. This is not a difficult concept. If you see a solid white on your left and a solid white on your right, cross-hatching on your left and cross-hatching on your right, you stick to the bit in the middle. It's not complicated. It's even something that's covered by our relatively pathetic driver's ed programs. You know, I am a huge proponent of the style of driver's ed that goes on in Western Europe and in Northern Europe. In the Nordic states, basically, if you get a driver's license in Sweden, you're a professional rally driver. But this is simple kindergarten level stuff. You don't color outside the lines. You don't drive outside the lines. So anyone who tries to sell the idea that these drivers just haven't gotten used to the new design, no. Okay, if we're talking about signals, signage, a new orientation or such of the turning lanes, that's another story. And even then, I don't really allow for much time for them to quote-unquote adapt. But this is relatively simple. And they stayed, you can't see this, but through the entire sequence as they drove by me, they never corrected back out into the lane, even though I was actually standing in the crosswalk while taking these photographs. So these drivers felt sufficiently comfortable illegally operating their automobiles in this no driving area, despite the fact that they're approaching a crosswalk and there's a pedestrian standing in the crosswalk. This is a bad design. Here's the problem, and this is a problem that most American traffic engineering, quote unquote, has, which is it is passive. So as you can see, what that means is that when we design things with the assumption that people will make harebrained decisions, and then assume that there's nothing we can do to stop them from making harebrained decisions, and thus we design roads and infrastructure in such a way as to present the least amount of consequence to the drivers who choose to make these, again, harebrained decisions. So in this case, we have a crosswalk. In truth, the crosswalk itself, functionally, is only 12 to 14 feet across. That's one lane of traffic that pedestrians should be having to cross. Unfortunately, that is absolutely not how far pedestrians actually functionally have to cross. They are crossing 2 traffic lanes and a parking lane, which is essentially 30 feet. So you're crossing 30 feet when you should be crossing about 12. And the only reason for this is because, again, Someone somewhere at some point said, well, if you put a curb there to stop drivers from actually driving where you don't want them to go, they'll hit it. Well, guess what, folks? That's what curbs are for. Curbs are not there for aesthetic purposes, for comforting purposes. Curbs are there to stop people from driving where you don't want them to drive. So if you don't want drivers to drive in this area with this crosshatching, there should be some form of curbing somewhere in this. Perhaps right here in the foreground where you see the grass at the right, this should extend out to the end of the crosshatching. That would prevent people from driving there. Of course, then people are going to say, well, what happens if they go through the streetcar bay? There's a solution for that too. I'm not going to get into that because that would be, I can't do that via voice. However, there is no reason why in the extensive reconstruction that has gone down at this project site that this curb could not have been extended outward sufficiently to block traffic from you illegally using this crosshatch area to pass, because you know this, I know this, everyone who has ever driven a car in the city knows this, that some jerk who is impatient and wants to get somewhere a little bit faster is going to swerve around somebody and use this crosshatched area as a passing zone. As proof of why this is what is going to happen, it immediately resumes being a two-lane street, which to me says that, frankly, someone decided that the volume of traffic turning onto Canal Boulevard at this point was sufficiently low to warrant a single lane. So why is the rest of Canal Boulevard still two lanes? But that's another issue that I'm not going to get into because it's very complicated and it deals with the entire length of Canal Boulevard, which I don't have time to get into. Again, reiterating myself. So the issue of infrastructure here is it's passive. We have design that is only controlling drivers by virtue of paint on pavement, which we all know does not necessarily do anything to protect pedestrians, cyclists, or other motorists for that matter. And for the record, the fact that we are still using these flashing yellow signs where they're with the beg buttons. A beg button is when you push the little button and you get the little flashing light or the "you can walk now" sign. People do not obey these. Anyone who has tried to cross on the Lafitte Greenway at Canal, at Broad, especially at Broad, I have crossed at Broad multiple times. I have never had RTA stop for me. I have never had NOPD stop for me. I've never had any sort of emergency personnel stop for me, even if they're not responding to something. People do not respect these lights because there is no legal backing behind them. There is nothing that will happen to a driver if they do not actually stop for these flashing yellow lights, which is why it's a waste of taxpayers' money. It's a waste of time and effort, and it's dangerous because it gives pedestrians, cyclists, and other road users a false sense of security. So to sum up this analysis, the Cemeteries Transit Center has several pros and several cons. The pros are its aesthetic design and the switch from solar power to mains electric power for the lighting fixtures. The cons, unfortunately, are the structure's functional design as to how well it protects or doesn't protect waiting transit riders from the elements. Also, the issue of drainage, both of surface drainage and also the management of stormwater runoff from the roofs of the transit shelters themselves. And finally, the traffic control mechanisms and designs put in place to manage automobile traffic as it passes through the transit center. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. If you'd like to learn more about my observations and positions on issues of urban design and transportation engineering, you can find me on Twitter at Miata_Taylor. and also through my advocacy organization, Walkable Jefferson Parish. We're on Twitter at WalkJeffParish, and we're also on Facebook. So come look us up and check out the sort of stuff we have to offer.